Thank you so much, Professor Raja Mohan, Professor, for saying something that we've been saying for. Can you hear me? Okay. And that is for the Lucist policy to be successful, it cannot bypass East and Northeast. So it has to go through this region, and for us to build connectivities with either Myanmar or Thailand or this part or even Nepal, Calcutta has to play a very central role. So now I will go over to Professor Hari Vasudevan, our own in-house expert on these issues. So Professor Vasudevan.
All the better. Ago, when I used to talk about 15 odd years ago, when I used to talk about geopolitics with Raja Mohan, he used to talk about a foreign policy for Calcutta, and it's interesting to notice that particular theme in his mind has never entirely receded. So something that has to be done out of the city is still a preoccupation with him, and the idea of actually doing things around the city, around the region, is something which has been running through his mind over many, many years now. It's a decade and a half at least that he's been throwing this idea around, and I think it has been thrown around frequently by you in this city. So he's attempted to draw people into the debate. I'm not meant to really to just pose questions. On the other hand, I'm not simply meant to sum up either. So what I shall do is a little bit of both, and try and open your minds to perhaps some questions that we can put to Raja in order to make this presentation of his, which is already fairly extremely broad-ranging, both more exciting and more challenging. Perhaps, in fact, the last bit especially, because after all, we all of us are somewhere concerned with improving the quality of the way in which we deal with our own region and our own city and where its future will go. Raja essentially deals with about 5 separate sections in this presentation, of which the kickoff really is to point out in the first two, the first one really, 1.5, that once upon a time India thought of itself as part of a much broader world, and that the links which actually bound India to that broader world were tangible, physical, commercial links which are associated with shipping, with commerce, with networks, which actually took us well into Southeast Asia, into West Asia and beyond. That within that framework we grew, and that finally, during the course of the post-partition, the post-independence era, we decided to remove ourselves from that space. The actual links and connections which tied us to the broader world could have been self-generated, could have been generated from outside. He leaves these questions reasonably open. So, for instance, partly trading empires that were associated with Muslim networks that were operating from Southeast Asia, from West Asia, were responsible for this globalization. Partially Buddhist and other networks before that. Partially the British Empire, which was in sync with a number of these networks as well as new networks that were set up during this period. From within that, India decided to put a halt to many of these links and connections and became much more introverted. within this scenario, we have two major developments, and really he gives a section to each of these. The first, in an explosive manner, he presents is the movement of China into a large global space and the challenge that it presents on our borders. So not only as far as the economy is concerned, but as far as security is concerned, a challenge in many different ways. I mean, it's a challenge about a way of life in his eyes. This particular arrival happens to coincide with a series of global changes which are associated with Washington Consensus, end of the disintegration of the USSR, etc., etc., all of which require that India adapts to a new world in a new manner, part of which challenge India refuses to do or is reluctant to do, primarily because of the social challenges as well as the strategic challenges that the Chinese economy, for instance, tends to pose when issues of connectivity, issues of links in the South Asian region and its broader neighborhood are actually posed. So, in this quandary, it's a quandary only up to a certain point, because all the changes of the 90s and the 2000s have required an opening up, have required a going out, have brought an end to the contraction of the mid-century. But the quandary which is placed before India is then to be resolved in a piecemeal manner. None of the challenges that China poses can simply be wished away. As Raja points out, essentially when you actually have developmental schemes, you have strategic initiatives which piggyback on these, witness the presence of the nuclear submarine in Karachi, etc., etc. The challenges are real, but the idea is not to run away from the challenges, but to engage with them, and within a global matrix attempt somewhere to build up your own resources, to move forward, and to look east, but to look east in a positive manner, which actually takes into consideration the growth economies of some of the eastern territories. Throughout the whole of the presentation, what Raja tries to point out is that space is not necessarily defined by geography, but that space is defined by a larger sense of connection, transport, communications, all of which have a particular rhythm of their own. They don't immediately just depend on railways, but they depend on railway policy. It is possible to think in terms of larger connections with the United States, United Kingdom, Europe, etc., quite clearly within such a framework. Because essentially we're dealing with global economies, and what you need to do is to open your ports, your airports, etc., to a series of these links which are global in character. So this issue of connection is very important to the way in which the presentation is made, and that is where the image of the new Silk routes actually comes into the picture, because essentially the Silk routes were to do with connectivities, and their refurbishment, the way in which they've been reworked in a global environment, this is quite clearly the way in which they have taken on a new avatar, a new focus, partly given to them by the Americans after the disintegration of the USSR, partially given to them by the Chinese, in way of both accepting the challenge of what the Americans provided, and also in developing their own answer to it in the One Belt, One Road formulation. So this large presentation then leaves us with this way of looking forward, where, as he says, you must know where you came from. You came from a global environment, you reduced yourself, and you are going back into a global environment, and the terms of your entry into that global environment are what you must now negotiate. Now, I would like just to pose some straightforward, I think that's a fair resume of the way in which you've handled it. I just have two or three, I think, fairly simple observations to make. First and foremost, I think I would like to point out that it's always nice to simplify the history in order to, as it were, to go back to origins. So the notion of our origin being global, our contraction being post-originary, and therefore going back to basics being a solution, I'm not quite certain entirely will hold water in the sense that the way in which you have presented it, that itself is the source of the question. Frequently, India's globality was created by others. It was not created by forces that were generated within the subcontinent itself. The subcontinent actually frequently, as my friend Bhaskar Chakravarti occasionally used to say, preferred to survive on the land rather than be drowned at sea. So it was very seldom that Indians would, with the exception of our good friend the Cholas, look east in a dynamic manner. There are a number of communities which were willing to dare the great connectivities of the sea, but they were few in nature. And they normally existed in time-specific periods, and by and large they tended to be coastal in their direction, rather than open sea. Most of the large Indian Ocean voyages were handled by Arab seafarers. The Southeast Asian directions tended to be moved mostly by coastal movement, with, as I said once again, the exception of the Cholas, who were very unusual seafarers. This, as far as we can see, is the way in which historical evidence lies with us. Most of our activity tended to be internal. I leave this as a historical problem. This is not something for debate, and I don't expect you to take this on, because this is the kind of problem which we can debate ad infinitum. There are those who will say yes, there are those who will say no. So please just take it from me that it's a comment that I'm making for as a challenge to you to read more, and to me to actually think a bit more about the subject rather than dealing with Raja's paper in essence. But I think what's important is to realize that the jury is still out on how far the internal dynamics of India are by nature global in orientation. India may be very attractive to others, others may come here, others may take things. India may be involved by others in a global economy, but that India should by itself, by nature, be naturally external looking, the jury is out on that in many ways. This is my historical comment. Second is a minor historical question, rather, and you don't have to answer the first comment, but is a question. What is it that actually led to the contraction? Can you simply wish away the forces which led to the contraction? Was the nature of the contraction entirely anti-global in character? For instance, the entire Nehruvian economy ultimately existed on the basis of a series of networks through which its inefficiencies could be corrected within a global space. Whether it be traders in London during the 1960s, 70s and 80s, whether it be traders in the Far East during the same period, whether it be those who were in West Asia and in East Africa, all of whom handled what we call today informal financial systems, that is, either the hundi, hawala, other such informal financial arrangements. India in strict sense, has never, even in its highest period of contraction, entirely been anti-global. It has required the global scenario in order to develop even its contracted space. Now, since this peculiar relationship came to exist between the two, is it easy to wish away the institutions that have grown up around both, i.e., the nature of contraction and the nature of the spaces as well as the institutions on which it was bound? There are some cases where we can see the way in which, say, Mauritius is used, or the way in which other places in which informal arrangements are used, even today, to back up the nature of India's globalization. I would pose a problem here for you, which comes from a recent past, which is that you cannot simply say that the contraction period is over. Its challenges are real, and it requires to be understood, and half the issue which pertains to the so-called reforms and to the globalization actually comes from the persistence of the institutions, the attitudes, as well as the connections of that era. It also comes from why the era was set up in the first place. That is, it comes from the notion of a developmentalist in a strict and narrow focus sense, as opposed to a commercial as well as an outward-looking, inegalitarian system of economy building and society building. There are two attitudes here, and even today in much of our national life, inequality is practically inbuilt into our reform processes, and it is never approached, and when it is approached, there is a continuous attempt somewhere to say, no, we are certainly not against the notion of egalitarianism or building an equal society. That particular position which the Chinese have increasingly come to accept, which is that an egalitarian society is a route to a communist future, that and that inequality is important in order to ensure growth, which, however, must be undertaken within certain narrow boundaries, that inequality and its acceptance. That particular notion has not become part of our national life in the rhetoric of national life. It is part of the reality of national life in terms of the way in which national life exists, but it is not part of what any government will ever accept in this country. So this is a major problem. I mean, when you are dealing with the reconnection in the way in which you are, the focus of that reconnection is continuously going to be challenged by this particular problem. The second thing I would like to raise is the issue of how you have suggested that the engagement should take place. My own position would be that the recreation of the Silk routes after 1991 as an image, as a format of thought, essentially came to us from the West. It is part, as you said, of the disintegration process after the Soviet Union fell to pieces, and essentially those who were using it were primarily American and European in terms of their orientation and extraction. The Chinese turned this particular system on its head, very much as they turned the system of connectivity on its head. If you go back to 1914, Raja, you will notice that the railway runs from Beijing to Bonn and beyond. So actually, in 1914, you could have traveled all the way from London, in fact, after you cross on the ferry, and finally landed up in Beijing. Okay, I can show you the handbooks that show. No, before the Soviet Union, all right, that is, with the connections that were made between 1897 and 1900 of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the creation of the Chinese Manchurian Railway, the connectivity was already in place, okay? What happened is that goods flowed west to east. The Chinese have turned this thing on its head, which is that now they wish to ensure that that connectivity drive is east to west. That is, that they will use these networks for their benefit rather than the benefits that the Russians and the Europeans gained from this particular set of connections in the early part of the 20th century. That's why I said the globalization of the 90s was essentially an attempt by the United States and others to reset the balance to a pre-Soviet era. The Chinese used the environment in order to set a new set of terms for themselves in which they, as the workshop of the world, would utilize the space given by the United States and Europe, and they have been successful. But why is it that India should buy into a Chinese dream, an American dream, or into a European dream? The Chinese have repeatedly been setting new terms in the way in which they define the use of law, the use of tariffs, the use of currencies all around. They are both protective as well as non-protective. They are both externally oriented investment, at the same time protective as far as investment is concerned. They use international law to their own specific aims, with their own specific... This is... No, wait. No. What I'm saying... Now, my question to you is, why should we not actually create our own rules of the game? What? No. Wait.
Have a road between Dhaka and Calcutta running.
What I'm
not talking about, they're not dominating the whole world. All I'm saying is build a damn road between Lahore and Amritsar, which you shut down. That doesn't require dealing with the world hegemony. It doesn't require to run a road between a transit through East Bengal. It doesn't need changing the global order. I'm saying it's your policies have fundamentally reduced your connectivity to regions that were once part of your own territory.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. So I'm not trying to argue, look, about all the past and how we reconstruct. I'm saying, lay the damn roads. It's not rocket science.
No, I said...
That's your policies actively discourage
I'm glad
connectivity with your own neighbors. Take the rest of the world.
No,
Let's ask her to finish it.
No, I am not actually... I said, my first comment I would rather you did not approach.
When you say something, you ask me for a response.
No, the first issue, as I said, is...
counterfactual, completely. Look, I am not reading this.
No.
All I'm saying is, look.
No, Raja, let me just take this. Let me go this. Yeah. My own sense is that you have an answer. So please, let me finish.
That's my preference.
No. I said your paper has an answer. Your paper's answer is that our response to the Chinese should be regional in character, i.e., it's this reconnection of the subcontinent, okay, and its immediate neighborhood.
Your own territory.
Now, but
because your own frontier, you disconnect it, right? So if you don't connect your own internal territory, forget the Chinese.
no, but we're dealing with the subcontinent ultimately, okay, from Afghanistan through to Myanmar, and that's roughly the subcontinent.
Srinagar railway line, 1893, we talked about a railway line into Kashmir. You still don't have that.
Yeah. Well, I can answer you on why we don't have. That doesn't matter. I've been studying your Waziristan and things like that recently. But anyway, I won't go into the history of this thing. My own sense, though, despite what you said about the region, and I, to be frank with you, I've been observing this when we're dealing with Kunming and with Myanmar. I'm not certain, given the challenge that is being posed to our economy today in a global space, that a regional answer is sufficient. My own sense is that the Modi government is far-sighted in the sense that it understands that the regional answer is not sufficient. That somewhere it has to build on spaces which are transnational and global in nature. And it is because of that that I am just a bit reluctant entirely to accept the necessity just for a regional solution to what I think today India faces as a global problem. So my poser to you is twofold. Firstly, will the shadow of the past so easily go away? And is it actually totally and completely an irrational contraction that was once there? Secondly, if we build our region, is the income even of this region, in the way in which it exists, adequate to solve our problems? If you look at the way in which, for instance, the Chinese handle Myanmar, this is a standard loot policy, which is you set up the road, you enter the country, you remove the resources, and you give nothing in exchange. All right? This is to build the main Chinese economy. It's not actually to build a larger market. The reason is very simple, which is the infrastructure and the institutions to make that market and to create it as a dynamic force in the future of your own economy is yet to be laid. And you, because of your own developmental failures, do not have the wherewithal or the capacity to actually create those alternatives on the other side. The Chinese answer is, just take what you want and get out. In the Indian case, we don't even have the wherewithal to be able to do that. So my poser is the regional answer sufficient? When you're dealing with new Silk routes, surely you should actually pose this as global routes of communication rather than as Silk routes. Ultimately, I'd say the term Silk route is still something which India does not have a serious investment in. I'd say we have to think much more broadly, because the two major gainers from that particular image are Chinese or Americans, as the case may be.
I'm sure.
But I'm not going to respond to the commentary on my 45-minute talk, so that's going to take the whole. Yeah, you did for 30 minutes, or to talk for 45 minutes. But I think I'm not going to do that. But I just want to make 3 points. Look, you exactly go on a track, I said, does not interest me. I'm not here to say whether what we did in the past was right or wrong. I'm just identifying 2-3 phases in your evolution. I'm not saying Nehru was good or bad. I'm saying that you took that was not simplification, that there was a set of economic policies that British India had. There's a set of policies Nehruvian India had. There's a different set of policies since 1991. I mean, that is a straightforward division of contemporary history. Now, the change in economic orientation, I'm saying, takes you in a different direction. That's all I'm saying. So I'm not here to second guess what was good or what was right, what was wrong. This is broadly a macro division of what contemporary India has gone through. So therefore, it is irrelevant for me that to question there's a heritage historian's job to study that. And not to say whether that is contemporary politics. I'm not interested in that, whether that was right or wrong. The second point to make, was that inevitable or not? Look, does it really matter today that you took certain steps, certain orientation in 47 to 52, which reduced the value of trade, right? You're not interested in trade. Therefore, you're not interested in expanding your connectivity. Did that mean there was no internationalism to Nehru? Of course, Nehru was a great internationalist. You met your fellow third world countries in New York, in Manhattan, bullshitting on UN resolutions, rather than meeting them with the region and trading with them. That's what you did. You met them today in the non-aligned summits, in G77, resounding exactly what you said. Let's change the global order first. That we cannot develop without changing the global order. That was the argument that you're posing today. The new international economic order was a claim that we are fundamentally doomed, and that the only way we can grow if we change the terms of the power distribution in the international system. What the East Asians have shown you was actually they can grow under the existing rules. And they've outdone the Western countries today. And that's where the struggle today, the second thoughts on globalization today are coming from the United States. That's where Mr. Trump comes from. What's happened today in Brexit is probably part of that. So therefore, the question is, was it inevitable or was it the only way? That is not what interests me. What interests me is that why is it that India does not trade with Pakistan? Why is it that India's trade with Bangladesh is so low? Why is it that we did not build railway lines in our own border areas? When Tinsukia Mail goes back to 1893, on the first plans to build a railway line to Kashmir in the 19th century, why is it that you did not do? Because there was a conscious strategic policy which said, I must keep my frontiers underdeveloped because somebody else will walk into that. That was the conscious strategy of the Indian state. I'm saying you got to change that today. So 3 levels at which you got to change. One, internal connectivity. This doesn't read, you're talking about, is it sufficient? I'm saying it is necessary. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying having roads that take you to Leh, Ladakh, that your railway line that runs across your own damn territory is a necessary condition for integration of your own state, which is what the Chinese have done in the last 30 years. After having shut down Tibet, shut down Xinjiang, that today they've connected those regions. That was what the West region strategy was about. So all I'm saying is the first step is to connect your own country. I mean, it goes back to Sher Shah Suri. I mean, every single IR theory tells you connecting your own markets, connecting your own states, building roads is not a genius statecraft. That is a central part. But you took a conscious decision not to do it for whatever reason, right or wrong. Question is, have we been able to correct it in the last 25 years? The policy in the last 20 years has been, we will push back our railways to our border areas. That's one part. Second part is, how do we connect it to the neighboring countries? There, with Pakistan, it's complicated by political problems. With Bangladesh, a whole range of different problems. But today, in the last 10 years, you've seen some improvement in the East. So all I'm saying, there is a huge potential in the East. If you build on that, there is more to be done in the East of the subcontinent. Third, have we overcome the problem, the resistance to globalization? Of course not. You see, Mr. Subramaniam Swamy, what has he done last few days? Mr. Modi goes everywhere, meets NRIs and says, guys, come home, help the country develop. Here is the great symbol of that NRI community. Running your Reserve Bank, you say, he's not Indian. That's what Mr. Swamy says, and he's that way. So that struggle will go on. I mean, I think, where is that struggle going to finish? Or are you going to wait till that struggle finishes? I'm saying the nature of your economy has changed. When Rajiv Gandhi died, your total two-way trade was $40 billion. 1980, Rajiv Gandhi stepped down in 1989. Today it is $750 billion of trade in goods and commodities. Throw in another 100 on services. That's your trade. Out of it, $2.4 trillion. Close to $1 trillion is your trade. Now, that is a new condition of the Indian economy. That condition requires both expanding your regional connectivity and international connectivity. And some of the international connectivity has come in through the NRIs, through the linkages that you have today. If somebody from my home state, good Andhra engineer, is killed in, say, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, my chief minister picks up the phone and asks the foreign minister, what the hell are you doing about it? 6 Malayali nurses in Kuwait or wherever it is in Iraq. So today, people are demanding that Indian state do more for its people abroad. So they're under pressure to do more things. So I don't see the struggle for that. Is it a conscious, happy globalization? No. There's no difference between CPM and the RSS when it comes to certain things, right? A left secular argument against globalization is equally strongly reflected on the right, who say, don't do, we still might go back to the East India Company. Don't do GM crops. Don't do this. Don't do that. So you hear a lot of that too. So that struggle is going on, but the fact is that struggle is taking place in a more complex environment where your economy has become dependent. Therefore, I think the challenges are complex. So I would say, look, past is never past, as you know. And that but the nature, some parts of our past have changed. The economic orientation has changed. The emphasis on connectivity has changed, but your implementation has not improved. Therefore, I would say, all I'm saying is, there are small things you can do on your own territory, in your neighborhood, and if there are connectivity projects that can be built, I would say engage the Chinese, engage the Japanese, engage the Americans, whoever it is who can do roads connectivity in your neighborhood. That's all the proposition here is, that connectivity has become a necessity for your economic prosperity, and that overcoming some of the tragedies of partition must necessarily involve reconnecting this Punjab and Bengal to yourselves. So that is the proposition. One is not going back to contest history, but each one of these propositions involves significant devotion of energy and a policy coherence to make that happen. That's all the proposition.
Thank you so much. Now we will take 3 or 4 questions maximum from the floor, and short questions, please. Okay, there.
I'm Debashish Das. I'm a student of IFPS, Calcutta University. My question is to Mohan sir. In a very lighter vein, you have mentioned the problem of Pakistan. You have very elaborately discussed about Chinese influence and their development. The thing is that we are facing more trouble, more problematic situation than Chinese do. Even around the world, you're just forgetting about the part of terrorism. We see every now and then blasts in our country. Let there be someone who blows some bridges in Beijing, coming all the way from Xinjiang, and then let's see whether China can develop that or not. When we talk about infrastructure development, because we are facing an area where our investments, our money goes to defense development more than any other infrastructure development. Because we have to think that any blast, any 9/11 does not happen once again. So how do you think on the back of, I mean, you can see today it's a historic day. European Union just crashed.
We got your question.
So on the backdrop of this particular thing, how do you think this building roads, I mean this Silk Road or any other over, can sustain for a long time and it will indeed give a better future for the subcontinent?
Debashish, thank you. We got your question. Yeah, there. Nirmal Babu.
We had been talking about Trans-Himalayan connectivity and about Buddhism, how it promoted it. Then you talked about the British initiatives and all that. My question is now, what the British did, the British initiative, British activities in Sikkim, in Tibet, in British interest in Nepal, possibly that is what alerted the Chinese and they started taking an active interest in Tibet. And that is what started the military rivalry between India and China, which has disrupted the entire connectivity in the Himalayan region and divided this region. So my question is, these imperious activities, even today you look at the United States. The United States is trying to promote connectivity. They are present in Myanmar. But in the name of searching for their Second World War crashes, they are planting listening devices on the border. So whether these activities, imperialist activities in the past or even in the present, this has rather helped connectivity or it has disrupted connectivity and standing in the way of reconnecting this part of the subcontinent?
Shubir?
The forces against connectivity, one of the important forces is the defense lobby. You alluded to it when you said there were people who didn't want the railway line to go up to the last mile. This is the defense people who said that, if the area is underdeveloped, the Chinese can't just walk in. The point is that this lobby in a new incarnation is again creating a huge problem for Sino-Indian relations, because they want a stronger military, they want military expansion, and by default therefore they have a vested interest in conflict with China rather than collaboration and cooperation with China. Because then you get to buy more American weapons, and the Americans love that. They replace Russia as #1 weapon supplier for India. The point I'm trying to make here is, you have said, and you're right, I agree with your entire exposition, that we should deal with the Chinese. We are all for it. We are in the K2K, Hari, for Jayanta Babu, we are all. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there is this very strong lobby, and I'm not just talking about some Subramanian Swamy or somebody like that. I'm talking of a very well-entrenched defense lobby, defense contractors, arms dealers, generals, raw people who vanish in CIA hands. 3 of them are gone this year. Very strong lobby which promotes conflict with China. General Padmanabhan writing about a Sino-Indian water war in 2029, predicting the next war with China is a cottage industry now. Somebody said 2012. This whole industry operates, this whole nexus operates in a very devious way, foreclosing possibilities, even limited cooperation or limited dealing with China. What's your take on this?
Last question, anybody? Okay, if there isn't,
There is.
if there is one, okay, last question. Last question.
I am Shahinder Pradhan. I am from CSIRT. My question is the India development cotton route against Silk Route and its development in Iran Chabahar port and this other is Bangladesh, Mongla and Paira port. So how to reconnect in subcontinent in Silk Route with India?
One last question there. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Rajamohan, for sharing your views. I'd like to invoke the point that given the incidence of growing trade and economic relations and the increasing tendency towards complex interdependence and the emergence of geoeconomics, do you find that geopolitics acts as a hindrance in the path of growing trade networks and in realizing the paradigm of geoeconomics? Thank you.
Now over to Professor Rajamohan.
The emphasis on infrastructure investments is fairly recent, right? I think, as I said, through the 47 to until now, in fact, you see, for example, on the railways, how limited the focus on expanding the Indian railways has been. I think after independence, we barely added, 10,000, 11,000 kilometers of railway to the 60,000 odd that we had inherited. While the Chinese had barely 10, 11,000 in 1949, they've crossed now 110,000 kilometers of length in China. We're not even talking about high-speed railways, we're talking about the normal railway system. So I think, look, that integrating your own internal markets and your turbulent frontier areas, that was neglected through the last 70 years, and that today, in the last 10 years, there has been talk, there is some investment, but the implementation there's been problems. While there are political issues in each of the frontier areas, whether it is Kashmir, whether it is today even in Punjab or within the East, the question of straightforward statecraft that you need to do more to integrate these regions. That doesn't it doesn't need such a complicated structure. I think we've largely neglected that task. Today we are talking about it. Therefore, linking your own markets today in your own country, we're not even talking about Bangladesh and Pakistan. That is the first step, and I think doing that today has become recognized at least as a worthwhile policy objective, and that's what's happening. But in terms of political stabilization, that is a whole range of issues. While the Chinese today are far better control of their frontier areas, but they also have problems of a kind that we're not very dissimilar to ours, but overall they're in better control. But today you might say that, look, there's more turbulence in Kashmir, but there is some kind of a process that unfolds. Was it good or bad? That's a different set, but that's not my subject for today's exploration. That integrating your own territory has gotten your attention, and that becomes even more urgent when you're talking about connectivity across your neighboring regions, and I think that is the point that was being made. The second point, I think, in terms of the issues that were raised, look, there will be politics of all kinds that goes on. The question is the state capable of doing some of the minimal functions? If you walk to the Nepal border, see you go to Raxaul, you see the road between Nepal and India. You see the nature of your customs station. You see the nature of your land border out there. It's pathetic. I mean, this doesn't, you don't need to compare it into all kinds of grand theories of ultra-theorizing. You just walk, see, go to Raksaul border, one of the busiest crossings between India and Nepal, which you had a free trade agreement with that country. See the state of the border. What pathetic state. I mean, you go to Lumbini and the Nauthanwa, Nauthanwa is on our side, Lumbini is on the other side. Buddha was born there. Probably one of the greatest points in the world. There's not much to be seen there, but here is the site. You've got to locate what is the symbol of Indian state, right? Any state's customs station is the classic symbol of the sovereign territory begins here. And an immigration guy who says, okay, show me your papers. Right? You go see, you got to go to find out where your customs station is. Well, you don't need Chinese being bad guys, Americans being thugs, or look, none of them have stopped you from running your own establishment right. So I think we can blame the entire world outside, but what is the quality of your state institutions? You might have the third largest military, but you walk to the Nepal boundary where you have such a pathetic state of basic infrastructure, and the police, the range of police structures you put in there actually harasses people who cross the boundary, so the Nepalese are taking home what they earned in this country. I mean, these are not about international politics. This is about minimal administration that you need to do for yourself. But in the name of a grand theorizing, in the name of building, in the name of fighting the poor, in the name of equality, you neglected the core functions of a state. And I think the challenge of connectivity is essentially in relation to that. That minimal functions of a state, of guarding your frontiers, of exercising sovereignty, and having the capacity to regulate normal trade, limit illegal trade, those are the normal functions of a state. Nobody is stopping, the Chinese are not stopping you from building roads in your own country. So the question is, look, have we devoted enough attention to that? That is the big question. The other thing, in terms of the military policy, look, you can't blame the military for it. Look, after all, civilians are in charge in this country. The military has been removed from all policy making since independence. It's in the beginning of independence. They don't make the policy on Silk Roads. I mean, you want to build trade with the Chinese. I mean, you are trading today. They are your largest trading partner. No. That's all there is. Look, it is sections. Yes, there are different sections. Finally, it is the political leadership that has to resolve your internal disputes. That it is today less the military, that it is and the civilian parts of our system which still can't figure out how do you deal with the Chinese economic power. You're right on, for example, on the visas. Prime Minister Modi has to fight with the IB and the RAW to say we will liberalize visas for the Chinese. Okay, we don't like the Chinese, the second largest economy. Is that the way you're going to deal with the visa question with the Chinese? So some of these need minimal reforms. So this is not requiring a fundamental change. I mean, I think in border administration, border management, building connectivity, these are fairly minimal tasks that we've neglected. And I think doing even a slight improvement in that will produce dividends. And of course, which will also require resolving some of the boundary disputes that you have.
I always wonder if I can just stay with that. Why Indian border road can build a trans-Bhutan border road, but they can't build a trans.
We cannot have follow-up questions. We will have tea. At that time, you can ask follow-up questions.
So the last question on the geopolitics. Look, I think we have neglected economics. I mean, there was a grand state-building activity of self-reliance, socialism, building public sector, all that stuff. But when it comes to trade, because trade was seen as a negative dimension, that a self-reliant economy doesn't need much trade. Therefore, okay, you apply that to the West, there's one logic to it. Apply to your neighbors, there is another logic. That today, you ask the Nepalese, you ask the Pakistanis, you ask any one of our neighbors. All the rhetoric of India and the UN talking about the protectionism of the markets of the Western countries, you just replace the West, put India as there, that's what applies to them. India is one of the most difficult markets to trade with. Whether it is non-tariff barriers are so high, You go to Colombo, you go to Kathmandu, you go to Dhaka, all they're talking about is NTBs. Now we've said, look, we removed all the normal barriers, at least for the LDCs, but the NTBs. So I'm not saying they're entirely right, but there are problems in the way we've thought about our borders, our trading across the borders, our relationship. So if you want to call that geoeconomics, I have no problem. But elementary aspects of trading with your neighbors, of creating structures of how do you regulate your borders, is the problem. And I think there, any connectivity, for example, would demand a fundamental reform of border management. For example, how do you let the good guys go through, legitimate guys, and stop the other guys from coming in? That requires, look, for example, today, the border with Pakistan is completely militarized. Those of you who've seen the new Utta Hai Punjab, you see that first shot where the drug is being thrown across, I mean, where you corrupt, the whole system gets corrupted through drug trade. You have a completely open border with Nepal, where there are a different set of problems. With Bangladesh, you have an anarchic border. Every day our Home Minister says, I'm going to fence it, as if that's going to solve your problems. You go to Assam, there are whole questions of migration. So you have inherited, largely because of partition and the economic policies that you pursued, extraordinary difficulties in what was this a single integrated space 70 years ago. So addressing this is far more consequential than all the grandstanding about changing the terms of global trade, altering the West versus East equations, North versus the South equations. This is within your agency, a large part of it can be managed if you fundamentally alter some of the approaches. But take the beef trade. I mean, you have, minister talks about, I'll ban all beef trade, right? I'll starve the Bangladeshis of beef. I mean, here is a cow belt and there is a beef belt. There is demand, there is supply. And you want to put yourself in the middle of it and saying, I'll put a fence, I'll stop the beef from going across this. Now, is that an enlightened policy or is it a crazy? And much of the problems on the India-Bangla border, a large part of it on this side, that is Bengal side, takes place largely because of the cattle smuggling. Are you willing to deal with it honestly? No. There is ideology or religion, we put everything into it. I think those are the problems. I mean, this is not super duper stuff. This is management of your own territories around you with a reasonable basis. And within that, there is a Chinese strategic complex today that is emerging. How do you deal with that? That again, I think there are places, I said, where you can collaborate with them. There are places where we need to find alternatives with the Japanese, with Americans, whoever is willing to do. In some places, by sheer local collaboration, that you can do things on your own. You can build some projects in Bangladesh. There are things that we can do. That is what, when you talk about geoeconomics in a narrow sense. But the Chinese as the number 2 economy, they're going to bring a whole range of things into play. And I think dealing with them requires firstly engaging the problem in the first place and not saying, because I have a border dispute with the Chinese, or the Chinese are not going to let me enter the nuclear club, I'm going to do something else. I think there you need a far more differentiated approach of dealing with the Chinese power.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajamohan. Years back, we tried to begin a sub-regional dialogue with Nepal and Bangladesh, because one of the main planks of connectivity is knowledge connectivity. So we completely failed because there was no support from the central government, nothing. So I hope ideas are changing, and I think one can think of it as a national response, one can think of it as a sub-regional response, but response there has to be, because the Chinese issue, I wouldn't say it to be a problem, is out there. Our borders are going to be flooded with Chinese goods, whether we like it or not. So, it's there to haunt us, so we have to create some kind of a response. And the more enlightened it is, the better, because it's the underground who can easily pass through different countries and do whatever they feel like. Politicians do the same. It's only the civil society or people like us who are stopped with the visa regime. So we have to rethink these regimes and develop some kind of a response of our own. Thank you very much, and here are some books from Calcutta Research Group. May I now request Dr. Madhurima Chaudhary to 'to come and offer the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajamohan. Thank you very much, Professor Rajamohan, for your presentation. I would like to invite Dr. Madhurima Chaudhary to come and offer the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajamohan.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajamohan, for your Asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of the Department of South and Southeast Asia Studies, University of Calcutta, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Professor C. Rajamohan for gracing your important work and sharing with us your findings and opinions today. I also thank Mohanirban Calcutta Research Group and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for collaborating with us. I express our sincere thanks to Professor Hari Vasudevan. We would also like to express our sincere thanks to the Center for Social Sciences, student participants and our colleagues from our and other departments. Thank you all and enjoy your evening.
Please join us.